All right, thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to read from my just published book, Ragtime Dudes in a Thin Place. And as you can infer from the cover, the story features three cocky young New Yorkers who go to New Mexico. And so that's the dudes, you get the dudes. And ragtime, you'll know what the time period is. But probably many of you are scratching your head and going, well, what the heck's a thin place? I first heard the term from an English minister, and she was describing the Celtic belief that heaven and earth are 3 feet apart, just out of reach. But the Irish Catholics believe that in certain natural places, certain wonderful places out in nature, that the distance was narrower. And I listened to her and I thought, yeah, there are places in nature where we feel a little closer to heaven. Our country has them too. And I recall people talking to me about Taos, New Mexico. I had not been to Taos yet, but the locals there claim that the mountain reverberates with a sacred hum. And so at that point I began to research Taos. Now today Taos is a well-known arts community in New Mexico with hundreds of artists who live there. But it had its genesis in 1902 when 2 European-trained artists broke their wagon wheel and they decided that they would stay there and paint. They liked the light. That gave me a time period for my story. Now, the early 1900s was an incredible time period of change for us. The ragtime music was new, the old-fashioned Victorian mores were out, and free love was on the rise. Yes, I know, my generation thinks we invented free love. But actually, 2 sisters in New York, 100 years before the hippies, were giving talks at Carnegie Hall to crowds of 6,000 advocating equality between the sexes and advocating free love. So I mentioned these 2 women in my book. The big event in 1904, though, was the St. Louis World's Fair. Probably the largest World's Fair that we've ever had in America. It was huge, and as I read, I've got some passages describing it in the book. The new century was exploding with new inventions, and this fair covered everything: art, science, industry, mining, anthropology. There was a whole village that we had just acquired, the Philippines. There was a whole village of Philippines. New Mexico had, which was not yet a state, had a pavilion there and had a whole tribe of Pueblo Indians who lived at the fair all the time. In the new century, the palaces there were illuminated with electric lights. Marconi had invented the wireless telegraph, and that was on display there. The gramophone made its debut. So it's while visiting the fair that my protagonists learn of Taos and decide that they're going to offer the wonders of the new century in an emporium there. The problem is, none of them know anything about business. So here's 3 photos of what Taos looked like around the time of my story. This is Taos Plaza from kind of a view of what the plaza looked like. Here's another view of the plaza from the northeast corner. And one thing you'll notice that it surprised me, but I'll just digress here for a moment to tell you, is that you don't see a lot of the kind of hacienda adobe style buildings that we associate with New Mexico. That was actually a publicity stunt by the Santa Fe Topeka Railroad, who promulgated this style of architecture because they thought it would draw tourists. So they went through and encouraged everybody to build these kind of buildings that we now associate with Taos. But back then, a lot of the buildings were just wood construction. The houses were Victorian style construction. There were some adobe, especially up in the Indian Pueblo village, this is very much what it looked like at the time that my protagonists would have arrived. Now, young people in their 20s, in their early 20s, have an attitude that they can do anything, whether they know what they're doing or not. And I think the body language of my 3 guys on my cover portray that cockiness, just in the way that they're standing. Now, back in the 70s, some friends and I decided that we'd open a bookstore. We didn't know a single thing about the book business, except we like to read, and we thought sitting around and reading books all day would be a cool deal. So although the characters in my book are fictional, I drew on our experience starting a business with no money but lots of optimism and ending it 2 years later with even less money, but still optimistic. And that more or less describes the arc, the character arc of my characters in this story. So now I'll read you some sections from the book.